It began with a quiet handshake in January 2024, a memorandum of understanding MOU between Ethiopia and Somaliland. Overnight, a landlocked giant declared it was no longer bound by its borders. It leased a stretch of coastline and secured possible naval access, and in doing so, it sent shockwaves through capitals from Washington. To Cairo, India, long building influence behind the scenes, stepped in with offers of infrastructure, naval cooperation, and economic partnerships. The U.S., meanwhile, stared at what looked like a strategic coup quietly unfolding in the Horn of Africa. But how deep does the India-Ethiopia Red Sea axis go? Did Ethiopia just lock the U.S. out? And is a new power balance being drawn on Africa's edge, one where Washington no longer calls all the shots? Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you'll see that what began as a port lease may rewrite the rules of influence across continents. Ethiopia hasn't always been landlocked. In the era of the Aksumite Kingdom, it traded across the Red Sea, sending ivory, gold, and spices to India and the Arabian Peninsula. Fast forward to 1993, Eritrea gains independence, and Ethiopia loses its direct sea access forever. From then on, Addis Ababa's foreign policy is haunted by that loss. Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed often frames maritime access as existential for Ethiopia's survival. He argues that with coastal control, Ethiopia breaks free. From dependency on neighbors, this longing is more than emotional. It's economic, it's political. Without a port, Ethiopia pays premium transit fees, is vulnerable to chokepoint blockades, and always negotiates access. But a port lease in Somaliland? That's something new, something bold, and we'll see how that boldness raised alarms in distant capitals. On January 1, 2024, Ethiopia and the self-declared state of Somaliland signed an MOU. Addis would lease 19 km of coastline in Somaliland for 50 years. In exchange, Ethiopia promised to recognize Somaliland's sovereignty. Suddenly, Ethiopia could build a naval base and move troops and ships. But a country like Ethiopia doesn't just act alone. India had been cultivating relationships in the Horn, investing, building, offering strategic support. Reports suggest India's interest in ports and naval corridors aligns with Ethiopia's ambitions. India seeks strategic depth in the Indian Ocean and Red Sea region. Because controlling sea lanes is power, that lease deal also bypassed Somalia's central government, angering Mogadishu. Tension erupted, but Ethiopia gambled that India's backing gives it cover. In the next section, we'll see how regional capitals responded and where the U.S. stood in all this. Ethiopia's move lit fires. Cairo saw it as a direct threat to Egypt's dominance over the Red Sea and its grip on the Suez Corridor. Somalia, furious, called for protests, rejecting the deal. It insisted Somaliland is part of Somali territory. Some even spoke of military countermeasures, but things shifted later. We'll return to that. Djibouti, which handles over 95% of Ethiopia's maritime trade via the Addis Ababa-Djibouti Railway, watched warily. If Addis builds its own seaport, Djibouti could lose leverage and trade revenue. And in Eritrea, which used to provide access to Ethiopia's sea trade via Assab, the threat is existential. Should Ethiopia contest Assab, things could turn violent. But all these responses pale when we look at the superpowers, because whether the U.S. fights back or is locked out will determine the real shift, and that's next. In public statements, the U.S. has reframed Ethiopia's maritime ambition as peaceful, diplomatic, legitimate. That may sound approachable, but in Washington's corridors, the concern is far deeper. Historically, the U.S. viewed the Red Sea corridor as vital. Control of bases and ports in the region allowed projection into the Indian Ocean and oversight of oil routes. Losing that edge in Ethiopia would erode U.S. posture across East Africa. So the question, is the U.S. backing Ethiopia quietly to keep influence, or is it playing catch-up? Ambassador Irvin Masinga recently called Ethiopia's bid for maritime access a fundamental priority that lends legitimacy. But in practice, has the U.S. offered the infrastructure or naval support? Not convincingly. Meanwhile, India is moving in silently, signing defense and supply agreements, offering funding and promising naval logistics. The U.S. has always acted overtly. India acts covertly. Washington's hesitation may be deliberate. If Ethiopia leans too much into India's orbit, U.S. influence will shrink. The rest of this video will show how India fills that vacuum and what Ethiopia is giving in return. India's foreign policy in Africa often flies under the radar, but it's growing bolder. It builds railways, invests in ports, and signs defense pacts. In Ethiopia's case, India's interest lies in opening new sea routes, projecting naval presence, securing energy and trade corridors, and balancing China's influence in Africa. India could help build the port, supply naval hardware, and anchor Ethiopian-India security ties. In return, it gets a stake in a strategic corridor into Africa's heart. More than that, with Ethiopia rejecting U.S. dominance, India becomes the trusted partner, and in places where the U.S. is seen as meddling or exploitative, India can appear as a less threatening power broker. But this alliance isn't free. In these deals, Ethiopia will pay in political alignment, naval cooperation, access rights, and perhaps joint military bases. We'll explore the costs next. You don't get a strategic realignment for free. Ethiopia's ambitions carry risks and hidden costs. First, sovereignty compromises. Opening your coast to another power demands trust. There may be secret clauses that tie Ethiopian policy to India's interests. Second, regional backlash. Egypt may deepen alliances with Eritrea and Somalia. Somalia's distrust of Ethiopia would worsen, possibly reigniting conflict. Third, internal politics. Ethiopia is already grappling with internal insurgencies, for example, Tigray, Amhara regions. A new national quest for sea power could be a tool to distract and rally the populace. Some analysts suggest Abiy is using external focus to redirect attention from domestic unrest. Fourth, overextension. Building naval infrastructure, defending against regional proxy conflicts, and maintaining a coastline will stretch Ethiopia's resources. Fifth, U.S. pushback. If Washington perceives this as losing influence, it may shift funding, pivot toward other allies, or even build counter-alliances. Now though, despite all this friction, something surprising happened in 2025. Ethiopia and Somalia patched things up, and that brings us to our conclusion. So here we are. From a daring coastline lease in Somaliland, to India creeping in as a new patron, to the U.S. watching its influence slip, Ethiopia's move marks a turning point. The port deal isn't just about a coastline, it's about power, presence, and narrative. It signals that countries long kept on the margins are now bending traditional hierarchies. In December 2024, Ethiopia and Somalia signed the Ankara Declaration, mediated by Turkey, agreeing to restore ties and commit to respectful, cooperative approaches on port access and territorial integrity. That tension doesn't vanish, it transforms. Watching from afar, the U.S. now faces a choice: re-engage with boldness, or step aside while India defines the edges, and Ethiopia. It bets that maritime power can rewrite its destiny. The lease is signed, the stakes are drawn, and the Red Sea currents just might flow in a new direction. But here's the thing most people don't realize: Ethiopia's Red Sea gamble isn't happening in a vacuum. Global trade is shifting, and whoever holds the ports of the Horn of Africa holds a lever over trillions of dollars worth of goods. Nearly 12% of the world's trade passes through the Bab el Mandeb Strait every single year. That's soil tankers, container ships, and food supplies. So when Ethiopia brings India into the mix, it's not just about one country gaining sea access, it's about tilting a global balance. For Washington, this isn't just a local matter. U.S. naval planners have long worried about a scenario where alternative powers, China, Turkey, or India, control the key choke points, and now Ethiopia, a nation often overlooked by the West, is giving shape to that scenario. It is almost poetic. A country once landlocked is suddenly dictating the terms of sea access in one of the world's busiest trade corridors. The question is, what happens if Ethiopia doubles down? Imagine Addis not only with a leased port, but with a functioning navy supported by Indian hardware, and trade routes that bypass U.S.-linked ports entirely. That would mark the beginning of a multipolar Red Sea, something the world hasn't seen in centuries. And here's the kicker: Ethiopia isn't stopping with Somaliland. Rumors swirl of future deals with Eritrea, Djibouti, and even Sudan. If even one of those lands, Ethiopia's influence explodes and India's presence grows alongside it. So, while the ink may already be dry on that first move, the real story is only beginning, because what looks like a narrow port lease today might be remembered tomorrow as the first domino that tipped the U.S. out of Africa's most strategic waters.